The contract offer arrived on a Tuesday morning in January through the most exclusive sports agency in the world. A proposal so extraordinary that Jorge Mendes had to read it 3 times before calling Ronaldo to schedule an emergency meeting, because the numbers were unlike anything he had seen in 25 years of representing elite athletes. A deal that would have made Ronaldo not just the highest-paid footballer in history, but one of the wealthiest entertainers of any kind. With guaranteed payments that exceeded the GDP of small countries, and endorsement opportunities that could have generated income for his great-grandchildren who weren't even born yet. But buried within the financial terms and marketing obligations were clauses that would have required him to promote policies and partnerships that contradicted everything he had said publicly about human rights, social justice, and his commitment to using his influence responsibly, rather than simply maximizing his personal wealth, regardless of the moral costs that came with certain forms of success. The offer came from the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, acting through a network of shell companies and sports marketing firms that obscured the ultimate source of the funding, but couldn't hide the political implications of a deal that was designed to use Ronaldo's global influence to improve Saudi Arabia's international reputation, while diverting attention from human rights abuses, restrictions on women's freedoms, and treatment of political dissidents that had made the kingdom one of the most criticized governments in the world, despite its oil wealth and strategic importance to Western powers who preferred economic relationships over moral consistency, when those relationships generated profitable business opportunities that could be justified as engagement rather than endorsement of authoritarian practices. The financial terms were structured to be irresistible, with a signing bonus of 50 million euros, followed by annual payments that increased each year for a decade, plus equity stakes in Saudi sports properties, guaranteed appearance fees for promotional events, and a post-retirement ambassadorial role that would have provided income until 2050. But the contractual obligations included requirements to participate in government-sponsored events, to avoid public criticism of Saudi policies, and to actively promote the kingdom's Vision 2030 initiative that was designed to modernize the country's economy while maintaining political control systems that prevented meaningful democratic participation or protection for citizens who challenged official policies or religious authorities. Jorge Mendes presented the offer during a meeting at Ronaldo's Madrid home, spreading the contract documents across the dining room table, where Ronaldo usually ate breakfast with his children. And as they reviewed page after page of financial projections and marketing commitments, Ronaldo found himself thinking about conversations he had had with human rights activists, with women who had fled Saudi Arabia's guardianship system, and with journalists who had documented the kingdom's treatment of critics and minorities. And he realized that accepting this deal would require him to become complicit in systems that oppressed millions of people, whose voices would be further silenced by his participation in efforts to improve Saudi Arabia's image, without changing the underlying policies that made such image management necessary. The meeting that followed with his entire management team revealed the enormous pressure that surrounded decisions of this magnitude, with financial advisors explaining how the Saudi deal could secure his family's financial future for generations, brand specialists describing the marketing opportunities that could expand his global influence beyond anything previously achieved by an athlete, and lawyers detailing the legal protections that would shield him from most contractual obligations if political circumstances changed in ways that made continued partnership impossible. But none of these professional advisors addressed the moral implications of lending his name and influence to a government whose policies contradicted his stated commitment to human rights and social justice that had become central to his public identity. The opposition to accepting the deal came primarily from unexpected sources, including his children who had been educated about global political issues through their father's charitable work, and who asked direct questions about why he would consider partnering with a country that didn't allow women to travel freely or speak openly about government policies. and from his mother, who reminded him that their family's values had been shaped by experiences of poverty and powerlessness that should make him sympathetic to people who faced oppression rather than willing to profit from systems that maintained inequality and silence through fear and economic control that prevented ordinary citizens from advocating for changes that could improve their lives. The research that Ronaldo conducted into Saudi Arabia's human rights record was extensive and disturbing, including documented cases of women being imprisoned for driving cars or traveling without male permission, activists being executed for peaceful protests, and journalists being murdered for reporting information that embarrassed government officials. And as he read testimonies from political prisoners, accounts from women who had been punished for seeking basic freedoms, and reports from international organizations that had been denied access to investigate conditions in Saudi prisons, he understood that his association with the kingdom would inevitably be interpreted as endorsement of policies that caused real suffering for real people whose names and faces appeared in the documentation that made abstract political concerns into personal stories of injustice and oppression. The meeting with Lujain al-Hathlul, a Saudi women's rights activist who had been imprisoned for advocating for the right to drive and who had recently been granted asylum in Europe, was arranged through human rights organizations that wanted to ensure Ronaldo understood the human cost of Saudi policies before making his decision. And her account of torture, solitary confinement, and psychological abuse for the crime of believing that women deserved the same freedoms as men provided a stark contrast to the sanitized version of Saudi modernization that was being promoted through sports partnerships and cultural events designed to distract international attention from ongoing human rights violations that continued despite public relations campaigns suggesting that meaningful reforms were being implemented. Lujain's story was particularly compelling because she had been punished for advocating for changes that the Saudi government now claimed to support. Her imprisonment revealing that reforms were cosmetic rather than substantive, and that the kingdom's willingness to pay enormous sums to associate with global celebrities was part of a deliberate strategy to obscure the gap between public promises and private practice that continued to deny basic rights to citizens whose voices were silenced through intimidation and imprisonment that made meaningful political participation impossible for anyone who challenged official narratives or religious authorities. The decision to reject the Saudi offer was made during a family dinner where Ronaldo's children asked him to explain how he could justify taking money from people who imprisoned women for wanting the same freedoms that their own mother and sister enjoyed without thinking about it. And when he realized that he couldn't provide an answer that would maintain their respect while accepting financial benefits from partnerships that contradicted the values he had taught them through his charitable work and public statements about justice and equality, he understood that some contracts were too expensive, regardless of the money they offered, because the moral costs were higher than any financial benefits could justify. The announcement that Ronaldo had rejected the Saudi offer was made through a carefully worded statement that avoided inflammatory language, while making clear that he could not associate with governments whose policies contradicted his commitment to human rights and social justice. And the response was immediate and intense, with Saudi officials expressing disappointment and threatening legal action for breach of preliminary agreements, while human rights organizations praised his decision as an example of how celebrities could use their influence to support oppressed people rather than the governments that oppressed them. Though some critics argued that his rejection was meaningless, given his previous willingness to consider deals that should have been immediately disqualified based on moral grounds rather than financial calculations. The financial cost of rejecting the Saudi deal was enormous, not just the immediate loss of guaranteed payments, but the broader implications for future negotiations with other sponsors who might question his commitment to maximizing commercial opportunities. And several existing endorsement deals were renegotiated at lower rates by companies that worried about associating with someone who had demonstrated willingness to reject lucrative partnerships based on political considerations that might complicate their own relationships with authoritarian governments that controlled large consumer markets. But Ronaldo found that the personal satisfaction of maintaining his integrity was worth more than any amount of money that came with moral compromises that would have required him to suppress his conscience in service of his bank account. The foundation that emerged from the controversy became a vehicle for supporting human rights activists and organizations that work to protect people facing oppression in countries where speaking out against government policies could result in imprisonment, torture, or death. And the Foundation's first major grant provided legal support for women's rights advocates in several Middle Eastern countries who were facing persecution for activities that would be considered normal political participation in democratic societies, but were treated as crimes against the state in authoritarian systems that maintain power through fear and silence rather than popular support or legitimate governance. The long-term impact of Ronaldo's decision extended far beyond his personal career, inspiring other athletes and celebrities to research the human rights records of potential business partners rather than simply focusing on financial terms, and creating pressure for more comprehensive due diligence in celebrity endorsement deals that considered moral implications alongside commercial opportunities, while also demonstrating that public figures could maintain their influence and earning power without compromising their stated values. Though such decisions required careful consideration of long-term reputation versus short-term financial gain that many celebrities found difficult to balance when faced with offers that seemed too lucrative to refuse. Years later, when Saudi Arabia's human rights record had not improved significantly despite massive investments in sports partnerships and cultural events designed to modernize its international image, when several of the activists whose cases had influenced Ronaldo's decision remained in prison or exile, when the kingdom's treatment of women and political dissidents continued to generate international criticism that sports partnerships could not effectively obscure, Ronaldo would reflect that rejecting the Saudi deal had been one of the easiest decisions of his career because it represented a choice between money and integrity that should never have been difficult for someone who claimed to care about justice and human rights. Proving that true leadership sometimes required sacrificing immediate benefits for long-term principles that were more valuable than any financial compensation that came with moral compromises too significant to justify, regardless of the amounts involved, or the opportunities that might be lost by choosing conscience over commerce.